The title of my paper is borrowed from the title of a book called The Two Classes of Men, Platonism and English Romantic Thought, published in 1972 and written by a man called David Newsom. His starting point is Coleridge's aphorism that every man is born an Aristotelian or a Platonist. He asks the question, is knowledge limited to our reasoning over things which we can see and sense, or is there some higher order of abstract truth? Is there something particularly Aristotelian about Oxford and something Platonic about Cambridge? And did these orientations somehow link Romanticism with high Victorian culture? Many others have played in different ways with this notion of mankind being divided into two broad and generally opposing groups, capitalists and workers, Republicans and Democrats, Catholics and Protestants, fascists and communists, arty people and pragmatists. There's something very subjective about these perceived divisions, of course, and in some mysterious ways, in any particular controversy, it seems that usually about half of us are in favour of something and the other half are against it. Gilbert and Sullivan summed it up perhaps best of all and most appropriately. Every boy and every girl that's born into the world alive is either a little liberal or else a little conservative. Some years ago I wrote a paper in which I maintained that the most important thing that had ever happened in the history of the world was the incarnation of Christ. To me that seemed inescapably obvious, incontestable and uncontroversial. But I was surprised at the reactions. One from a mathematician who firmly insisted that the most important thing that had ever happened was the invention of the wheel. Well, you know, from our perspective, I suppose, speak for most of us, wheel or the creation of the universe from nothing? Ooh, that's a hard one. Though we were mates, this man and I, he had no clue how my mind worked, nor could I ever share his purely materialistic worldview. No matter how hard we tried, we couldn't both be right. There's no room for doubt that one of us was as wrong as it's possible to be, and not just a bit wrong, but cosmically wrong. So this great gulf, there's a great gulf that divides believers from unbelievers. And it's a gulf that crosses all the other divisions and ignores them, which is why sometimes those of us who are believers feel that we're lost, that we're not liberals, we're not Labour voters, we're not this, we're not that, we don't fit into our world. And we think with St. Paul, here we have no continuing city. Or if we like country and Western music, we might agree with Jim Reeves that this world is not my home. And it's particularly sad when this gulf occurs within families or among close friends. Sometimes we shirk that sadness by pretending that it doesn't exist. But it can't be made to go away by mere denial. Regardless of what side of the divide we're on, we cannot avoid the truth that our friends on the other side simply don't think as we do. Not just about small matters, but about the biggest matters of all, the most weightiest issues. This is not just about favourite colours, taste in music, taste in food or clothing. No, our beliefs draw us far beyond what Lucretius called the flaming ramparts of the universe, the flammantia moenia mundi, to an eternal destination and endpoint that entirely shapes our thinking. So that's by way of preface. This deep division of believers from unbelievers shapes our opinions in all sorts of ways. Let's look, for example, in the field of education, which is very much germane to what we're talking about. Here are some problems that face education from time to time. Excessive class sizes, shortage of physical resources such as air conditioning, the abuse of alcohol and other drugs, both legal and illegal, bullying, other forms of appropriate behaviour. These problems around class sizes, heaters and coolers, alcohol and other things, sex, bullying, fighting, all relate to material security. And I don't make light of them. They are not trivial, They're matters of real concern, and it's perfectly reasonable to strive ardently to deal with them. But their positioning in the minds of most of us is at the forefront of our worries, as a matter of controversy. For unbelievers, they may be all that matters. For those of us on the other side of the Great Divide, they are, in a sense, peripheral, side issues of a greater crisis. Another crisis, to my mind, recognized to some extent, is what I call specialization. I think somebody mentioned this one this morning too. Too much specialization too soon. I mean that educational pressures more or less force top students to specialize early and to neglect important aspects of their enculturation. For example, the would-be doctor, engineer, or vet, in order to compete for a place, must concentrate on maths and the sciences as early as possible. In doing so, may encounter very little of the humanities, may not learn to write confidently or speak with maturity. Of course, many in those professions are widely read and highly cultivated, but there is a gravitational pull, I think, particularly in schools nowadays, towards exclusively career-focused studies and away from artsy subjects viewed as irrelevant or just taking some examples, sport heads the list of favourites for most people, most school subjects or school activities, and not merely a subject. It's the most popular activity, I suppose, in Australian schools. After sport, the next most popular are those that relate or are thought to relate to worldly success and advancement, the trades, IT, economics, accounting, for example. This is not to say that students always enjoy those studies, but they persevere because they see them as the essential key to material success. And too many see little value in them at all in poetry, music, or art, for they're irrelevant to the main game. If early in their school days they enjoyed creative arts, as probably we all did when we were at sort of kindergarten stage, parental and employment pressures all too often draw us away from them. And then Wordsworth understood this. I don't know whether you know the poem, the awareness, as you grow up you lose the magic. Shades of the prison house begin to close upon the growing boy, but he beholds the light, and whence it flows, he sees it in his joy. The youth who daily farther from the east must travel is still nature's priest, and by the vision splendid is on his way attended. At length the man perceives it die away and fade into the light of common day. For many of us, the root of all these crises lie beyond the realm of the purely material. There's an old story about Cardinal Gilroy coming back from the Vatican Council, the Second Vatican Council, and being asked by some media person what he thought was the most serious problem facing the church today. And he said, original sin, which was glib and clever, but also, of course, very wise. The fact that most people see it as merely witty shows how far we've travelled from ultimate reality. Now, a greater crisis than deprivation of physical comforts is the loss of self-awareness, of an understanding of our place in the universe, of a common shared culture. It's the failure to ground students deeply in such things as history, reading, writing skills, ethics, and of course faith. We're producing generations of people who are spiritually blind and historically tone deaf because there's no consensus anymore on what should and should not be taught. We've reached a kind of an impasse. But the most important things in the world are too often ignored. The most important things in the world, I submit, in the intellectual world anyway, in the world of everyday life, are ideas. Ideas initiate action, or to use a term that's been used a lot in this conference, Ideas are upstream of actions. I like the phrase, so that's why I'm enjoying using it. Ideas cause things to happen, sometimes on a huge scale. They have immense power for good and evil. And I think we'd agree, people on both sides of the Great Divide would agree with this, but we might approach it differently. But sadly, in my experience, most young people lack the practical experience or even the mental maturity to recognize the importance of ideas. It sounds like dry as dust stuff. But here are some ideas that I'd like you to consider, and you'll probably have different responses to them, of course, but here's just a jumble of ideas. Africans are less intelligent than Europeans and need to have masters to tell them what to do. Jews betrayed Germany and by reason of an international conspiracy and ought to have been expelled. Men and women have equal ability and should be treated equally. All goods should be shared and there should be no private property. A free market with the right to private property brings out the best in human nature and allows people to optimize their potential. Capital punishment is the appropriate penalty for serious crimes. No human being ought to kill another under any circumstances. Women who commit adultery should be severely punished, preferably by stoning. There's a big difference between a fetus and an unborn baby. There's no difference between a fetus and an unborn baby. So lives have been lost or saved. Generations have suffered or thrived as the result of ideas like these being applied. Every one of them has at some time or other attracted a following, sometimes with good, but often with appalling consequences. By and large, the power of ideas is commonly underestimated, or ignored, especially, I think, by young people, as I've said before. We simply don't see these as relevant to our daily lives. But sadly, such young people grow up to be old people of the same type, blinkered, content with an unexamined life. There's something strange and stunted about a society that doesn't think very deeply, assigns a primary value to ball games, gets its biggest kicks out of the pace of a horse or the speed of a swimmer, and takes pleasure from listening to other people making music rather than playing or singing ourselves. The result of all this retrograde of this failure to make progress intellectually is three things I can think of. People who have no sense of history can have no sense of direction, no formed or mature sense of where they're heading. Worse still, they're susceptible to bad or false history, crazy notions based on ignorance or deceit. People who can't express themselves clearly in writing or speech are likely to be woolly thinkers and may not fully understand all they read. Belief in God, which should be the most natural thing in the world, has been so sidelined that it now appears perverse and crazy to people who instead place their trust in crystals, astrology, reincarnation, pseudo-scientific notions about multiple universes, and so forth. Some of these God alternatives are actually not of a spiritual nature at all either. When you think of it, reincarnation is about the continuance of life as we know it. Astrology is just astronomy that's gone a bit crazy. There are crystals, there are pseudo-medical solutions to everything, but they're all of a physical nature, I suppose. Sorry, I'm just sort of skipping a bit here because of the timing. Wishful thinking passes for informed opinion because it's much easier to wish that something might be so than to prove it. And so to people of this mindset, whose minds are undisciplined and ill-formed, whales are more important than babies. Possums are more precious than old people in nursing homes. Smoking is a more serious sin than infidelity. Exporting our coal and uranium for other nations to use is a valid contribution towards combating climate change, and science will no doubt extend our lives to hundreds of years, as if we would want that. This is a Walt Disney world. When you wish upon a star, makes no difference who you are, anything your heart desires will come to you. When you wish upon a star, your dreams come true. The emergence in school and university curricula of scores of new subjects to choose from may be superficially impressive, but courses in tourism, rock music, surfing science, criminology, gender studies look more like entertainment than scholarship. This trend has been boosted, I think, by the popular leftist and quasi-democratic notion that university degrees should be accessible to everyone. The corollary of such a dogma is that if a student cannot manage a challenging subject, he must be offered something easier, while pretending, of course, that it's not. When all is said and done, what is the point of teaching anything at all to people who don't know the difference between a noun and a verb, who can't think critically, even if they've been persuaded that they can? You can spot that I'm an old English teacher, of course, in this. Or don't understand the history of their own country and its place in the world. Putting the horse back in front of the cart, remembering how to crawl well before trying to walk badly, learning to think really clearly and to express our thoughts sharply and accurately, reading and studying the best books and the best ideas of the best and wisest people who've shaped the world for good and for evil. These are the important things. These are the foundations of a rebirth of humane education, if it's to happen. I greatly admire, as you probably wouldn't be surprised to hear, I greatly admire Campion College and treasure the time I spent there. Campion teaches only one degree, an arts degree, and restricts its teaching to core subjects: history, literature, philosophy, and theology. There is no room for intellectual stocking fillers in that system. The vital purpose of Campion is to strike at the roots of crisis, not merely at the symptoms. A man or woman will be a better doctor, lawyer, teacher, or tradesman for having studied these liberal arts first, blending faith and reason in the classic Christian way that is intellectually rigorous and religiously aware. Materialists who think materialists who think that there is no spiritual aspect to human existence at all are caught in a trap of having to concede that robots will soon appear that differ in no respect from real humans, because those who deny the spiritual dimension must surely conclude that all moral judgments are merely chemical in origin, chemical or habitual, I suppose. This way of thinking explains the spread of euthanasia. If you can put down a cat, why not any other animal, including Grandad? Now, it was a grammarian, of all people, by the name of Woodcock, who wrote thus. It's a quote I like very much. Lucretius and Darwin assumed that human languages were the natural development of animal cries in the ordinary course of evolution. Nothing could be further from the truth. There was a whole world of difference between noises that are conditioned reactions to physical stimulus and noises that are deliberately organized into an artificial system of signals. The language barrier between men and animals does exist. It consists in the power to sort out and classify sense impressions. Animals live in a world of particulars. And then he goes on to say, in this sense, there must have been a first man. Now, that's a little challenge for those of us who know nothing about science, but who tend to think that Darwinism has all the answers, because it doesn't seem to explain the reality of humanity. Humans and animals, even the highest of them, are essentially different. Shared DNA has nothing to do with it. Clever as whales and monkeys no doubt are, they have produced no literature, no art, no evidence of reasoning power or of meta-knowledge. Attempts to excuse them on the basis that they lack voice boxes or opposable thumbs lack cogency when one considers the career of somebody like Helen Keller. Animal lovers, including myself, like to talk about their pets' occasional acts of naughtiness in quotes, but terms like that are only metaphors. Your dogs and cats can't be naughty or wicked or even cruel. They can't sin. They can't willfully and knowingly disobey you. They can't fear for abstract fears in the future or experience amazement or wonder as we do. Professor Jim Franklin wittily remarked once, I love this, "Are you surprised to hear that humans and monkeys share almost the same DNA? You might be surprised, but the monkey isn't." No monkey is ever surprised, sadly, much as we love our dogs and cats. Cardinal Gilroy's off-the-cuff remark was actually spot on, in my opinion. Alone of all creation, we humans have the power to act responsibly, and though created good, have also the potentiality and too often the inclination to refuse responsibility and to pursue our own interests, even ruthlessly. So, nearly there. How do we answer the question that this colloquium puts to us? Can we arrest the decline of civilization? And if so, how? The way back, if we're not already too late, I don't think we are. Like Kevin, I'm optimistic about this. The way back is to do all in our power to extend not wokeness, but awareness. You can't teach wisdom, but you can certainly cultivate and nourish the seedbed in which wisdom can grow. 2,000 years have taught us that there's no quick fix of the great divide. There's no quick way of converting the rest of the world to believe as we do. And there's no easy way to close that gap. But what we can try to do is to sideline the big issue and find ground somewhere else. So the heat goes out of it a little bit and we reach agreement elsewhere. And where? Well, my answer is by concentrating on that area of education whose neglect has been the most grievous, that has had the most dire consequences. I'm talking about history. History, properly used and well taught, is a seedbed in which wisdom can grow. In the neglect of history, what I lament most is not the rote learning of dates or the squabbling about unresolvable psychological issues, which historians are often quite fond of. We don't need to know how many casualties there were in the US Civil War, for example, or the dates on which the battles were fought, but we do need to know that it happened and that its effect on the United States as a nation has gone on for generations and probably continues to this day. It was a very, very formative thing in the history of that nation. It's the separation of historical knowledge into small modules or units, stripped of wider context, that's most inimical to true understanding. Too much detail, perhaps, not enough understanding of wide movements. If I were to say that Australian history began in 1788, I would be rightly condemned by Aboriginal historians. But I'd also ought to be widely condemned with equal vigour by Europeans, for our history is incomprehensible if detached from its formative intellectual, spiritual, legal, scientific background. Incomprehensible. History is something that those of us who are Christians need never fear. We can stand the full glaze of the sun, even if it exposes our shameless misdeeds, for there are also so many good things, too often in the dark, that deserve to be seen again and honoured. The root idea behind the word history is inquiry. Honest inquiry may uncover shaming things, but if pursued resolutely and with integrity, it will uncover many wonders. We must accept both the good and the bad with great honesty. The black armband might be the right approach in some situations, but there is also much cause for celebration in the history of our nation and indeed of any other. Among the wonders, St. Paul insists that the existence of God can be known by rational observation alone. And quoting from the Epistle to the Romans, "For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead." Now, this idea that the unaided and unbiased human intellect can recognize the existence of God was subsequently taken up by Augustine, Anselm, Aquinas, and most surprisingly I think, is that it had even been foreshadowed by the pre-Christian Cicero, who died 50 years before Christ was born, who wrote astonishingly the following. He said, "There exists one true law, one right reckoning in accord with nature, common to all men, unchanging, everlasting. Its commandments call us to duty, and its prohibitions deter us from deceit. It was established by divine authority and may not be annulled." So the natural law, in the lips of the highest of the pagans, is there even before Christianity emerges. The world is our schoolroom, not the two-dimensional world of our daily experience, too often distorted by the fashionable cynicism that poses at honesty, but the whole parade of history through time and space. An educational system that looks at the world diachronically rather than synchronically, in which all our studies, literary or scientific, are examined contextually, rather than split into unconnected gobbets, should be our chief educational goal. So, thank you.